We find one of the things discussed in this parsha, Yaakov, he summons Yosef and he says to us, Yosef, I asked of you, and I want you to take an oath that I should not be buried in Egypt. I want to be buried in the Marsa Machpelah. So Rashi cites a number of reasons why Yaakov didn't want to be buried in Egypt. One reason was because he was concerned they would deify him. And that would be a problem. Therefore, by burying him in Canaan, that would avoid that. The other reason he cites is because ultimately there's going to be the plague of Kidim, where the earth is going to turn to lice. And as a result of that, they will actually affect his remains in the ground. The third reason is because at the time of Tchias HaMesim, a time of resurrection, all the resurrection takes place in Eretz Yisrael. So whatever this means, the bodies would have to roll underground, subterranean, and therefore there's a certain degree of pain. Therefore, to prevent that, he wants to be buried in Eretz Yisrael in Marsa Machpelah. These are the three reasons Rashi gives why Yaakov did not want to be buried in Egypt. But one of the reasons was he didn't want to be deified. We read in last week's parsha about the famine, and when Yaakov came to Egypt, the famine stopped. Why did the famine stop? Now, the bracha Yaakov had given to Paro was what? That when he goes down to the Nile should rise towards him. That was the bracha he had given Paro. As a result of that, because the parsha ends where the people had ready, they depleted all their money, their livestock, and they said, we'll give our bodies and our land. And Yosef says, I will give you, although you are the subjects or the chattel of the king, you will take 4/5 for yourselves to plant, to eat, and 1/5 you'll give to the government as a tax. So Rashi over there asks, what's the point of planting? It was a famine, nothing was growing. So Rashi says, when Yaakov came to Egypt, it ceased. Because the Nile now rises. So why did the famine stop? As a result of Yaakov giving the bracha to Paro. So Paro, it's interesting, until Paro received the bracha, Paro was a monarch, he was an ordinary person, relatively speaking. All of a sudden now, he realizes he has divine powers. Life is water, and now suddenly he goes to the Nile rises towards him. He doesn't understand. Of course, he understands, he attributes it to the bracha, but factually, he himself is experiencing godly powers. And the many psukim where Paro refers himself to, I am the serpent of the Nile. I am the serpent of the Nile. He believes I created the Nile. Because since he had total maximum control over the Nile, because whenever he would go down to the Nile, it would rise, and this was the source of life in Egypt. So he believing and understanding that he is the source of life, he convinced himself, and he believed that he was a deity. Although he knew he was human, and we find that he conceals his bodily functions continuously. Why did he conceal his bodily functions? I mean, he knew, was he being two-faced to the people? No, he believed he was a deity. However, if people would know he has bodily functions, they do, this would actually diminish their understanding of who he is. So he had to conceal it. They should appreciate who he is. But he truly believed he was a deity. But he believed he was a deity only because of Yaakov's bracha, which he had given him. Now, if Yaakov has the power to give such a blessing, what is Yaakov's power? Do they understand what a blessing is? To that dimension, to that degree, it's like he actually endows divine powers to people. He's able to do this. Therefore, Yaakov himself was concerned that as a result of that, people would understand or believe that he would be a deity. Therefore, he says, I don't want to be buried in Egypt. I want to be buried in Canaan. Now, how were people aware that Yaakov even arrived in Egypt? So Chazal tell us that the two human beings who received the greatest glory ever in the history of the world were Yisro and Yaakov. Why? When Yaakov came to Egypt, Yosef, the Torah tells us, hitched his chariot and went out to greet his father. When he went out to greet his father, Yosef, being the most powerful person in the world, the viceroy of Egypt, the sustainer of life on a global level, all the courtiers of Paro followed Yosef. As the courtiers are going after Yosef, the elders are going, the sorcerers, the wise men, there wasn't a person in Egypt did not go out to acknowledge Yaakov. And therefore, the glory that Yaakov had seen and experienced was one of a kind. So Yaakov was put on a pedestal, which was the first time in the history of existence, nobody was ever put on such a pedestal. So he became this renowned world global figure, but then after he went into concealment. Because Yaakov wanted nothing to do with Egypt, and Yosef guaranteed him he'd be away from the Egyptian society in every sense of the word. So Yaakov is this person who merited to have this level of recognition. Then he goes into concealment. That's how people were aware that Yaakov even existed. Otherwise, how did he even know? Yisro, when he came out into the desert, and Moshe Rabbeinu came to greet him, because Hashem says, "You go greet Moshe, you go greet Yisro, and your wife and his two children." If Moshe is going, who follows Moshe? Aaron Ubanov, Aaron and his sons, and who follows Aaron and his sons? The Zkanim, and if the Zkanim go, who follows? Every Jew that left Egypt, who was there in the desert, went out to greet Yisro. That level of honor and glory was one of a kind. So Yisro and Yaakov merited the ultimate level of honor. There was no such honor ever given to anybody in the world. So Yisro also became this renowned figure, at least among the Jews, that he was, besides being Moshe's father-in-law, and regardless of his background, he was given that dignity and that distinction that he was worthy of this kind of recognition. If they deify Yaakov, you say it's not his fault, right? The people will be liable. What does that do with Yaakov? The Gemara tells us in Bamitzir, we have this, in Asochas Paulim, that one of the Amoroim would go and he would whitewash the graves of the tzaddikim. Why did he white? Because, and he would put lime on it, because since bones are white, so to indicate that there were remains of human beings in these various locations, he would whitewash the graves. So Rashi explains why. Because since if Kohanim would go there and become contaminated, and they'd eat truma, and the person who was buried there is the cause of that Kohen eating truma in a contaminated state, there'll be some level of liability for that tzaddik that's buried there. So the question is, the man died years earlier. Initially, there was a marker on the grave, but because of the winter rains, the whitewash was dissolved. How do you fault a person? It doesn't make a difference. If something negative comes about through somebody, there's a degree of liability to that person. Doesn't make a difference. Here we find these people, they were buried years earlier. But if a Kohen should pass over the grave and not realize it's a grave, and he's contaminated, he doesn't even realize it's contaminated, and eats truma, there's liability to that tzaddik who's buried in that location. So Yaakov himself, if he becomes the object of idolatry, that people start worshiping him, unrelated to him, he's not asking it, he doesn't even try to encourage it, as much as he discourages it. But if that becomes a reality, the reason why there's this level of idol worship in the world is because he's buried there. Therefore, it identifies with him. There's some level of liability. He doesn't want to have any relevance to that whatsoever. Therefore, I'll not talk about anything. Sorry, don't bury me in Egypt for that reason. Now, I once said something which is interesting. There's another reason which is mentioned in the Midrash why Yaakov didn't want to be buried in Egypt. We find that I mentioned this. Yechezkel refers to the Egyptian people. They're like chamorim. They're like donkeys, because he depicts them as, he says, "B'sar chamorim b'sorim." The flesh of the Egyptians is like the flesh of a donkey. Okay, so we'll discuss it in a moment. We once mentioned how the Maral explains that. If you remember, the Maral explains that of the 70 root nations of the world, the nation that was the most devoid of spirituality was the Egyptians. How do we know this? Because we find that Yechezkel refers to them as chamorim. In Hebrew, the word chomer means material. Of all the nations of the world, they were the most materialistic in their makeup. They had the least degree of spirituality within them. There was the greatest spiritual void. And as a result of that, therefore we find there was witchcraft, there was every level of abomination was in Egypt for that reason. Because there was nothing to counter, there was this vacuum of spirituality, therefore you had everything else that existed there, which was the antithesis of Kedusha for that reason. That's how the Maharal explains it. Now, the Maharal explains that Klal Yisrael had to be in a location for us to rise to the ultimate level. It had to be a setting which was spiritually void. It had to be the least degree. Why? Because just as we find, the way I explained it, creation is what? Is yesh mi'ayin. It's not attributed to the location. If they would have had some degree of spirituality, so we are based on what they are. Klal Yisrael had to come from almost out of a vacuum, like an ex nihilo evolvement. That's what we were when we left Egypt. So we can only rise to that special level if we have no identification whatsoever with what Egypt's about. That's the reason why the Golus Mitzrayim had to be in Egypt, not any other location in the world, because they were Chamorim. That's how the Maharal explains it. And that's how he explains what we say in Hallel, B'tzeisho Mitzrayim, Beis Yaakov Me'am Loes. We went from the Am Loes, like this foreign, this alien nation, when we left Egypt, Am Loes. Because they were, Loes means something so alien to what Kedusha is all about. That's how the Maharal explains it. Now, the Medrash says, if you have a donkey, the first issue of its mother, what does the Torah tell us? You have a choice. Either you redeem it with a sheep, or you break its neck, and you give the sheep to the Kohen. If you have a chamor, it says, tifte beser. You should redeem it with a sheep. So the Medrash says that Klal Yisrael is referred to as the sepizura, with a scapegoat. But it says something much more specific. It says, sepizura Yisrael. Yaakov is Yisrael. He's like the seh. He's like the sheep. So Yaakov says, I don't want to be buried in Egypt, because just as the sheep redeems the donkey, I don't want to be a redemption for the Egyptian people, because I'm the seh and they're the chamor. And I don't want to be the pigeon for the chamor. Therefore, I'll not takvirim Mitzrayim. Therefore, don't bury me in Egypt, because I don't want to be the redemption for the donkey, because I'm the seh. I mean, it sounds beautiful, but what does it mean? I mean, by being buried there, how could he be the redemption for the chamor? That's the question I asked. I explained in the past that, as I just said, why did Hashem choose Egypt to be the location of the exile? Because only that location, which is the most devoid of Kedusha, of spirituality, only from there could Klal Yisrael evolve to become the greatest, the holiest nation. We're able to achieve the ultimate level of Kedusha when we leave there. Because our status has no relevance to what's there, because there's nothing there. If Yaakov would be buried there, when a person worships a deity, how do you worship a deity? You have a deity of the fertility, of grain, of fruit, of whatever it is. It's all connected to the physicality of the world. So one brings gifts You bring material gifts to what? And by that, you're actually serving the deity. How would you serve? If Yaakov would be a deity, how would you serve Yaakov? Yaakov was a person who was totally removed from physicality, from the material to the nth degree. He had no relevance. He negated everything in existence, and all he had to do with was what? He lived like a being which was not a human, not a physical being. So how would you, and somehow become subservient and serve him that he should respond to your requests? By emulating him. So that means if the Egyptians would start emulating Yaakov's behavior, being more detached, elevating their level of purity, comes out what would be? They're less chamorim. They become less material. If they become less material, what happens to us? We're in a location where this automatically undermines our potential to be able to rise to the ultimate level. That's what Yaakov says. Since they're chamorim, they have the ultimate immaterial. They have the least relevance to spirituality. It's the greatest vacuum of spirituality, and that's what we hear, and that's why ultimately we're going to be able to achieve that ultimate level of growth. If I'm buried here and they worship me, I become a redemption. I become the seh, and I will be redemption of the chamor. I will create a conversion from the chamor. They're not going to be chamorim any longer. And if they're less chomer, we're less spiritual. Therefore, Yaakov says, "I'll not take Mitzrayim." Therefore, I don't want to be buried there for that reason. That's how I explained it in the past. Yaakov lived 147 years, 33 years. He could have lived, but Hashem took 33 years off his life, which we're not getting into why. If Yaakov would have lived another 33 years, what would have been? We read, Rashi right begins, Vayechi. Vayechi is a Pasha Stuma. Based on its paragraph structure, the way it's written in the Torah, it's a sealed portion. Why is it a sealed portion? So Rashi cites the Medrash, Shenistu Eineim V'Livim Shel Yisrael Ne'ashibud, that the eyes and the hearts of the Jewish people were sealed because of the bondage. When Yaakov passed away, what did that mean? Yaakov himself, as long as he was alive, being in that location of Egypt was no different than being in Eretz Yisrael. He was able to deflect every aspect of whatever that society was that had no relevance to the Jewish people whatsoever. On the most infinitesimal level, it did not affect us. When Yaakov was in Choron, although Choron, what it represented was the cardinal sins and plus much worse than that, he was able to raise 11 of his children there. Because Yaakov himself was able to deflect whatever that level of representation was. As long as Yaakov was alive, especially here, he was even more advanced. He was able to insulate us from any of those negative influences. The moment he passes away, there's some level of seepage of that impurity of Egypt, even though we find that as long as Yosef and his brothers were alive, the Jews did not in any way deviate. But at some level, even Yosef and his brothers were affected by Yaakov's passing. Being there, they were affected. And that's Niswa Einayim V'Livi Shel Yisrael Ne'ashibud. If Yaakov would have lived another 33 years in Egypt, he would have lived his full 180 years. That means Klal Yisrael would have been unaffected for another 33 years of whatever Egypt was. When we left Egypt after 210 years, what we would have been? Would have been a different dimension of spirituality. Maybe the Jews would have never come to a point where actually the bondage would have actually been a physical bondage, because we had mentioned in the past what activated the bondage. The Jews said, we want to be uncircumcised like the Egyptians. When Hashem says you want to be uncircumcised like the Egyptians, here the Milah is the covenant. You identify with me. It's the covenant. It's the Milah represents the Chet of Adam Rishon, Eitz Hadas, and that's what you want. If that's the case, the Egyptians who until now they revered you, they will hate you, and you will actually cause them to be concerned that you're going to rule over them. They will enslave you. If Yaakov would have lived on another 33 years, Who knows if they would have come to that, make that kind of error, to want to be associated with that. But factually, because Yaakov passed away 33 years earlier, and the bondage started 33 years earlier at a certain level, and it progressed, we regressed gradually. Yaakov passing, Yosef passing, his brothers passing, then everything just fell apart. And then the enslavement, the physical enslavement started. So he'd say, reason why things are the way they are is because that's the way God wants them to be. He'd say, if Adam or Rishon wouldn't have eaten of the Eitz Hadas, you realize the world would have reached its level of perfection from the first moment, and all the Chil Hashem that have passed nearly 6,000 years wouldn't have happened. So why does Hashem allow him to be challenged that God, knowing the result of that, look what we've been dealing with. We've been dealing with all these issues continuously. Now, David HaMelech, which we mentioned the Medrash many times, Hashem had shown Adam HaRishon every person who will come into existence till the end of time. And Hashem had shown him a special soul, neshama. And Adam sees this neshama and he says to Hashem, who is this soul? It's a very special soul. So Hashem says to Adam, the soul is meant to live just a few hours, then it's going to die. So Adam says, I'm willing to give 70 years of my life to that person. That person should live 70 years. And that was David HaMelech. David HaMelech, 70 years, were the 70 years that Adam was meant to live 1,000 years. Adam lived 930 years. He gave 70 years of his life to David. Okay? Because he saw David being that so special. Now what happened? Who's David? David is Melech HaMashiach. The tikkun of the world, that the world will come, the world will achieve its level of shleimus, of spiritual perfection, will come through who? Through David Melech Yisrael. David Melech Chai B'Kayom. Adam failed. And he failed at a level, how does he somehow correct that failing? He personally couldn't correct it. But by endowing David, that special neshama, with his 70 years, ultimately, he understood that person, that through that person, that correction is going to happen. And Mitzvah Hashem, it will happen. Once Melech Mashiach comes, whatever, and that's the Ramban. God will circumcise your hearts and the hearts of your children. So the Ramban explained, what's the circumcision of the heart? The effect of the Eitz Hadas will be expunged from us, that naturally all will be involved in, fully immersed, is serving Hashem. All the passions, the desires that are contrary to what Kedusha is, they're no longer going to be. That's going to come through what? That's come through Melech Mashiach. At that moment, that expungement is going to take place. So Adam, by endowing the special soul with those 70 years, will achieve what Adam wasn't able to achieve himself and correct his failing. Yaakov lived 17 years in Egypt. Yaakov Shnei Chayev. And the days of Yaakov, the years of his life, Sheva Shonim, Arboim Mashono. 147 years. The Torah says, how many years was he in Egypt? He was 17 years. How old was Yosef when he was sold into slavery? 17. Right? So what Alan alluded to, the Chazal tell this, and the commentators explain this, as we find by Sari Menu, how old was Yitzchak at the time of the Aked? He was 37 years old. Now, Sari Menu was barren. She gave birth at the age of 90. How many years did Yitzchak spend with his mother? 37 years. Vayu Chayu Sora. What was the life of Sora? Vayu. The numerical value of Vayu was 37. That was the life of Sarah, although she lived 127 years. But the ultimate life of her life was the most qualitative years was the years that she had Yitzchak. Vayechi Yaakov, Vayechi, numerically is 34. The 17th first years, when Yosef was, until he was 17 years old, and the last 17 years, which is 34, that was the life of Yaakov. Because Yosef was the apple of his eye, as we explained in the past, because he was Ben Zekunim, because he was the one who was going to guarantee the survival of the Jewish people, that ultimately there should be Yitzis Mitzrayim to go to Sinai. That's Vayechi Yaakov Eretz Mitzrayim. Okay. Let's take a look at Rashi. Vayechi.
It's really giving everything else short shrift.
Okay. Let me ask you a question. It says Yaakov loved Yisrael as Yosef Mikol Bonov. It says Yisrael loved Yosef from all his children. Keep Ben Zekunim below, back over there, right? This is before he bought from Miksomis Pasim. It doesn't say Yaakov loved Yosef more than his other children. It says Yisrael. And we explained many times, and we'll see it here too. The Torah goes back and forth. Yaakov was the original name, and Yisrael was that he was endowed with that name when he defeated the Malach. He became Yisrael. Your name shall no longer be Yaakov, it will be Yisrael. Because you lorded over God and man, and you succeeded. Meaning, whenever Yaakov, being the spiritual person, which it has to do with the spiritual destiny of the Jewish people, Yaakov was always referred to as Yisrael, not as Yaakov. That's what we're called Bnei Yisrael. We're not called Bnei Yaakov. Bnei Yisrael. Because we are the eternal people. It says, Yisrael Avas Yosef Mikol Bonov. Does say Yaakov. Because Yisrael, Yosef was the Lahava. He was the flame. He was an extension of Yaakov to be able to contend with all the issues of exile, as Yaakov was. So therefore, since he was the one who was going to guarantee the survival of the Jewish people, despite the influences of the world, therefore it's Yisrael of Ki Ben Zekunim below. Therefore, it says over there, all that he had studied in Shem Ve'ever, that Torah, he only shared that with Yosef. He didn't give it to the other sons. He also shared it with Binyamin, as we had Vayigash. Ki Ben Zekunim below. So therefore, it's of. So therefore, there's 34 years he spent with Yosef, mentoring him. And what's the reason why when Reuven switched the bed out of the tent of Yaakov from Bilhah's tent and put it in Leah's tent, why was that considered so sinful? Why did Leah was a matriarch, Bilhah was not a matriarch. So why didn't Yaakov put his bed in the tent of Leah? Why in the tent of Bilhah? Who is Bilhah? Bilhah was the maidservant of Rachel. Being the maidservant of Rachel, she knew exactly how to attend to all the needs of Yosef, to raise him as Rachel would have raised him. Therefore, Yaakov, where's his location? It's with Bilhah. Not because Bilhah has any innate more value than Leah. Leah's a matriarch. She's not a matriarch. But regarding the development and the mentoring of Yosef and his spiritual development, she was crucial. The other brothers didn't understand it, how that important it was. And Reuven made this mistake. And because of that, he forfeited the kingship, he forfeited Kuna because of that. But that's how integral it was to the future of Klal Yisrael, that his bed should be in the tent of Bilhah, not in the tent of Leah. Okay, now, we started off Yaakov. Yaakov lived in Egypt 17 years. Now, V'yikru Yimei Yisrael Lamus. Not V'yikru Yimei Yaakov Lamus. The days of Yisrael came close to pass away, to die. V'yikru V'nei Yosef. V'yomelo Im Nomot Zechem Beinecho. If I find favor in your eyes, Simno Yotcho Tach Shirechi. Put your hand under my thigh, which means to correspond to the circumcision. Similar to what Avram had done with Eliezer when he took the oath. When you take a Torah oath, you're supposed to take an object which is a mitzvah, Vasisi modi chesed ve'emes. And you will do with me a chesed ve'emes. I'll not take breathing Mitzrayim. Please don't bury me in Egypt. Okay? So why did he summon Yosef? Rashi says, because he had the ability to actually to carry out his request. Simni yodcho v'shaveya. Take the oath. Chesed ve'emes. There's a famous Rashi. Chesed she'osi im meisim hu chesed shelemes. She'enu mitzaper l'tashlum gemul. When you do a kindness with a person who passes away, there's not even to be considered that maybe you're doing it because there's going to be some kind of reciprocation. Person's died. There's no reciprocation. I'm not bring Mitzrayim. Sovalios Afrokinim. First reason Rashi cites, which is the Medrash, was ultimately the earth in Egypt will turn to lice. Uberachim tachus gufi, and they will crawl under my body. Shane Mesich Chutz Loretz Chaim Elo B'tzar Gilgul Michilos. At time of resurrection, they have to undergo a certain process till they're resurrected. Shaliasunim Mitzrayim Avodah Zorah. And the third reason is they should not deify me. Those are the three reasons. Okay? That's why I don't want to be buried in Egypt, for these three reasons. V'shochavti mavosai u'dusanim Mitzrayim. I will be with my forefathers. I will lie, and you will carry me from Egypt. U'kvartani b'kurosam, and you bury me in their burial location. V'yom anochi esek l'orecha. He says, I will do as you request. Now, Rashi himself explains, based on the Medrash, why did Yaakov ask Yosef to take an oath? Take an oath is not a simple matter. Take a shvur. But he wanted him, is it because he felt unless he took the oath, Yosef's not going to carry through? It's a question of trust. Being bound by the oath, that will guarantee that he should be able to carry through his request. So the Medrash says, when Yosef originally rose to power, it became known to Paro that Yosef knew 70 languages.
71.
Wait. Hello. Alan, I don't make that kind of mistake. Okay? That Yosef knew 70 languages. Now, I mean, he didn't take a Berlitz course. How did he know 70 languages? The Gemara tells us the night before he was released from prison, Gabriel had come to him and taught him 70 languages. That means besides Lashon HaKodesh, besides Hebrew, he knew an additional 70 languages. Paro was fluent in 70 languages. Hebrew, Lashon HaKodesh, he had no relevance to. As much as he tried to learn the language, he wasn't able to learn the language. He maxed out at 70. Yosef was 71. When it became known to Paro that Yosef knew one language more than him, he made him take an oath that he will never divulge this to anyone, that he knows one language more than him. Because if it would become known, he'll be dethroned. Therefore, Yosef took an oath. Yaakov knew this. Yaakov knew that he took an oath. So Yaakov says to Yosef, I want you to take an oath. Why? Because when I'm going to be, my request is what you're going to ask to fulfill my request. Paro's going to say nothing doing. I'm not. So you're going to say to Paro, but I took an oath to my father. So Paro will say to you, but it's irrelevant. Even though you took an oath, you'll violate the oath. So Yosef, you will say to Paro, if you want me to violate the oath that I took to my father, I will violate the oath that I took to you. And if I do that, it's over for Paro. Paro is no longer the king of Egypt. As a result of that, that's the reason why Yaakov had asked Yosef to take the oath, only because ultimately he's going to have this level of confrontation, and the only way he's going to be able to do what Yaakov wants is only by having the oath. That's Chazal. So I asked the question. if you know 70 languages, 71 languages, why does that determine whether you can be dethroned or not dethroned? You know, one language more than more. With knowing Yosef has 71, it's over for Paro. I mean, factually, there was an interpreter, right? I mean, Menashe was the interpreter. When Yosef's brothers came to Egypt, who interpreted? Who spoke? Who interpreted between them when they believed Yosef was an Egyptian? Menashe was so people knew Hebrew. So it was obvious. So Paro knew people knew that, but to be contained with one person, 71 language, that's not possible. That's what he understood. And if it would be known that it's possible, it's over for him. Why? We want to discuss this in the past. Rabbeinu Bachi explains the title of the Egyptian king was always what? Was Paro. That was the monarch. The monarch was Paro. I mean, they had a name. Paro this, Paro that. But it was Paro. Why Paro? Because the letters Ayin Pei Reish are contained with the word Paro, Ofer. The society, everything in Egypt was built on a certain theology. What was the theology? Nothing exists outside of the physical realm. Whatever exists outside the physical realm, the ultimate of purpose is physicality. There's nothing in the spiritual realm which is spiritual. The deities, their value is purely material. That's offer. That's earth. Everything's earthy. Now, 7 represents natural. That's a natural order. What is 71? 71 is supernatural, something which supersedes the physical. To have contained in one person something beyond 7 is not possible. In existence, everything maxes out at 7. So 70 is multiples, 10 multiples of 7, but it's 7. Yosef being 71 automatically says that is based on a false premise. The foundation of the Egyptian civilization is false. Once that happens, it's over. Everything crumbles to dust. Therefore, Paro says, you cannot ever reveal that you have one more language than I am. And that's what Yaakov says. If he wants you to violate your oath, you're going to violate his oath. And that's the end of Egypt. Therefore, understanding that, immediately gave permission, take your father, fulfill his request for that reason.